So first of all, thank you for here. We are very honored on behalf of McKinsey to speak here. And then a special thanks as well to Safri Paul and as well to Sasso for orchestrating this. I think it's very inspiring here to see all the different players along the value chain. So not only like the petchem players, but also to see some of the waste management players, more upstream, as well as the packaging players. If we go to the next page, let me see if it works. It does. Excellent. So how we were thinking about this presentation. So we have two different views that we as McKinsey want to share with you. One is the global view. That I will cover for the next 10 minutes. But then after, and probably more importantly, then we want to translate that into an African view. So let's start with the global view. And also fully aware that there are many pages and it's many words. So what we will do also after is that we will share the document for the ones who are interested in the details, and you can always read through. For now, I will promise I will keep it simple and focus on the key messages. So if we look at the market view, I think here are basically 4 important trends here to highlight. So number 1 and number 2 are both linked to the demand side. So this is very much focused on the growth drivers behind the demand. And here, the key message is the demand for recycled plastics is real. And that is basically driven by 2 factors. One being the brand owner pool. So those are all the voluntary commitments from the big players. And I will focus it on the next page. But they are basically driving the recycled demand for each of the plastic bottles that you will see in the supermarket. The second big driver is then the regulation. And we already spoke about it yesterday, but today I will share a bit more of the global view. And the regulatory measures are getting real and are being implemented, not only in Europe, not only in the US, but also like across the whole world. And as we heard yesterday, also in South Africa. And then the third thing here to highlight is that we are getting better as a world in 2 things. So we're getting better at actually collecting the feedstock, but also getting better in actually separating it. So we have the higher quality fractions, and our sorting capacity and capability is also getting better. As a result, is what we will get and what we will see is that we have a higher quality of plastic waste, which will allow us to make more recycled plastics also through the mechanical route. And here, the 4th point here to highlight is the technology. So we will dive a bit deeper into the advanced recycling after the break. But I think what we now see is also like across the whole world, the technology is getting there. And as I will elaborate later on, it's not so much like a silver bullet. They're really different technologies. They're all complementary. They all serve different markets, but they are ready to scale. And I think with those key messages, so the demand is real, the feedstock is there, we are getting better at sorting the fractions, and the technology is actually there to scale, it all looks green. So that is, I think, the overall message. We are very positive from McKinsey, if you look at the market, that it is ramping up and scaling. Now let's dive a little bit deeper into each of those points. So the first one, being the brand owners. So as you can see, probably here we see an overview of each of the different brand owners and their recycled targets. And these are all brands that we know from going to Checkers, going to the Superspar or the Woolies. There, like when we pick our shampoo bottles, we all know these brands. And what they have is, as you can see on this graph, they have very ambitious targets, mostly for 2030. 25 is not seen as sort of like the end state, like they're really all focusing on 2030. But what we also see on this graph is another point. And that is that they're not there yet. As you can see, like it started pretty good, looking at 21. But then I think over the last years, also the reality is it didn't grow as fast as we were expecting. So this is the last view, also based on 22 and 23. And like, as you can see, there is still a big gap to close here. But that said, and also because we, the end customers, are pushing for the recycled product, we are making the deliberate choice that we preferred a recycled bottle of shampoo versus a virgin plastic one. We are pushing those companies to have those ambitious targets. And I'm still fairly positive that they will get to their targets in 2030. But this point is just to show, because those are like the big players in the market, that the demand based on the voluntary commitments is real. If you then go to the second demand lever, that was all focused on regulation. And again, I won't go into much detail here, but it is maybe helpful to point out a few of the key insights. So what we did, so first of all, if we maybe start with the darkest blue, or it's almost black, one is Europe. So here, if you look at the regulation, there are all different sorts of measures. So here again, it's not one silver bullet, it's really like a different set of levers. So in Europe, for example, the policy is always focused on the recycled content, so that they, for example, say that they demand a certain share of recycled plastics by 2030, as well as helping the collecting sites and making the economics work. So we spoke yesterday also about the EPR systems here in South Africa, that they also made mandatory in Europe. And they have all other sets of measures. So for example, like the ban on single-use plastics. So I was the other day in the US, where they still have those plastic straws that you won't see in Europe anymore. And this is all because of the regulation. And then fourthly, like there are lots of recycling targets where they say like, hey, let's make sure, or let's set very bold and ambitious targets to ensure a certain recycling target. We just heard the number 38, or I don't know what the number was again. But by 2030, there are big announcements also especially for the packaging space to hit the recycling targets. Then here maybe the second thing to highlight here is then the US. I think they are, in terms of regulation, the answer is actually there is not one thing as the US. Like here, it's very much of a state dependent outcome. And I think here most of the regulatory drivers are coming from California and the New York area. And then there is also sort of like the mid or like the Texas region where the regulation is not as stringent yet, but it will come. And then the third message, I think, what I want to say is not only about the US and about Europe. Actually, when we look from a global view, regulation is ramping up massively. So for example, also just to mention some of the example countries where we did also some of the studies, some calling out here, Mexico or like India, and then especially Africa as a continent. So here, of course, as South Africa, we try to be the leader. But I think in Adolf will also cover later on, there are also many initiatives going on in other countries. And then we have, of course, also not to forget about China. We just had a conversation with Maarten as well. But here, indeed, like the regulatory is also ramping up quickly. I think you mentioned 300 laws are now currently in place. So here we see also like a strong regulatory pull. Key message is the demand is real, and we see lots of regulatory policies ramping up and becoming more stringent across the globe. If you then look at our demand outlook, so as I just mentioned, so the demand driven by the brand owners that are pushing for those targets as well as the regulation, we expect to grow. So almost to 60 MT, I think, by 2030 on the global rate. But then, if we look at the supply and we look at our current understanding of the market as well as all the announced projects, then what we will see is that there will be actually a shortage. And then it would be helpful to understand, like, hey, why can we not meet this? Why can we not meet the blue arrow? And then I'm going to explain on the next page. So what I here took as an example is just a product flow of each of the different, of actually a waste flow for Europe. And I think the last numbers that we had were 22, so it's a bit outdated, but it illustrates the picture very well. And here, the point I want to make even today in Europe, there is no such a thing as a recycling loop at scale. So what you can see here on this picture is that you see the plastic waste on the left-hand side. And a big chunk of the plastic waste is now going directly into incineration and landfill. And landfill only in the countries where it's still actually allowed. And then what you can see is that only like a limited share is now going into the recycling loop. And out of that share even, there will be, again, a part of it that will go then into landfill or into the incineration. Part of it will be downcycled. So those are typically like the flower pots or like the plastic bags type of plastics. And only like a very small share is actually ending up as recycled plastics again. So this picture again shows that at the moment, like we have a very big ambition, but the supply chain, as it is right now, it is not a recycling loop at scale. That is one picture that I want to share, and that the reason is that you can see on the right-hand side with some challenges, which I will now explain in a bit more detail on the next page. Because what I always try to, and what I hear also from the clients that I serve both in the waste management space, as well as the petchem players, as well as the private equity companies who are interested to play a share in this game, is that there are many different challenges across the value chain. And those challenges are very different from the virgin value chain. So let's start, for example, on the left-hand side, feedstock. And with feedstock, I just mentioned plastic waste. So what we see about feedstock, it's a very fragmented game. So picture a recycling plant, which will need to source its own plastic waste that will arrive by truck. So it really depends on the quality of the plastic waste, really depends, of course, on the source of the plastic. But it will also be very different per point of source of plastic waste. So it is really, by definition, because you need to ship or transport it by truck, it's a very fragmented game. And also there are lots of differences in the quality of feedstock. That is a challenge on the feedstock side. So how you can make it economically and scalable. Then on the recycling side, and that's always what I hear, something that I hear from different investors and from the different PE companies, they always are a bit insecure. What is the technology that we need to bet on? And there's a sort of, people are, like there's so many types of technologies, people are not sure like what to place their bets on. And I think here the answer is really, and as we will also see in later discussions, there is no one winning bet. There is no one winner takes it all technology. There are many technologies in place that are scalable, and they are all actually perfectly complementary. And then there is still here the third point, and then I will deep dive a bit on the recycling after. And then the third point that I want here to highlight is that you will always, especially when you go into the advanced recycling route, you will be always dependent on the established processes of a steam cracker. So you always need to feed in the pyrolysis oil into the cracker. So therefore, and you also want to make sure that it's not contaminated. So therefore, there's always a challenge of fitting a relatively simple product like plastic waste with a different variety of quality into then a very established process of a steam cracker. And then fourthly, I think one point here to call out is then the plastic customers. So what we hear from the different brand owners, they're very much interested into buying product, but it's always a matter of funding. So who in the value chain is going to be the player that's going to invest in the capital-intense technology? And here the answer is more often into the long-term contracts. So what we see now, also for example, if I look at one of my petchem clients, they're building a very big pyrolysis oil plant. That is really capital intense. But what you don't want, of course, is that once you invest the money, that you have the end customers not buying it. So here, like really like the game is, or what we try to achieve, is that there are long-term contracts, so people are confident that people will buy the products against a certain price, so we can hedge our investment. And maybe just one point here, then to deep dive, and then I will shift later on to Adolf, and that is on the technology side. So as I just mentioned, people are getting confused, and so sometimes I get as well, like, what are all the different products? What are all the different routes? And is there one simple, best solution? And the answer is, it is perfect complementary. So let's assume on the left-hand side that we have plastic waste. So after getting out the glass, getting out the metals, all the other plastic waste, like you will have plastic bills. Then the higher quality fractions, those are typically going into the upper route. So those are like the mechanical recycling plants. And like out of that, you will get a set of products. So picture your shampoo bottle that you buy at Woolies. This is the route that actually uses the higher quality fractions and serves a different market versus the bottom one. And then the bottom one, and we will speak about it in a minute as well, is then focused on the advanced recycling. And here the beauty is that it is very much complementary. So it will use a lower quality fractions that can feed into the pilot plant. And out of that, we are actually able to make virgin-like quality plastics. So here again, it's also not only a different type of feedstock that we use, but it's also very much a different target market that we actually serve, which is then focused on food-grade packaging. And I think here the point with the technology, and then I will focus on to the second part, is that we are currently actually at the sweet spot. So if I take a step back and I look at other markets, then I think we, at the plastic recycling market, are now at the perfect spot. And I call it the near convection spot. So what is the difference with the top and with the bottom one? So if you look at the top one, here you can think of solar panels, here you can think of markets that are already proven. So they're highly mature, highly commercialized. Here, the risk and return rates are relatively low, and as such, is not as of an attractive market as the other ones. Then if I look at the bottom one, it's very much focused on the early convection. So here, there are lots of technologies that we still need to prove, and whether it's a question whether we can make it scalable, yes or no. So if I then look at the recycled plastics market, we are in the sweet spot. Like, we know the technology works. We know how to scale it up. We just need to make it work. We need to orchestrate along the value chain that we can get the feedstock, that we can separate the high-quality feedstocks, that we can indeed make sure that we hedge our financing, and we have the end customers who are buying the product. And I think one point just to close it out is this example. Because I always hear the question, so the recycled plastics, yeah, is it not a future dreamy world? And I always try to make it very concrete. So if I am the end customer, I do my groceries on Saturday, and I look at the price. And then I have two price points. So I have the price that I pay if I would buy bottled milk based from virgin plastics and from the recycled plastics. And I think, yes, there is a slight difference in price, but that's only for the packaging part. If we then translate that to the end product that the end customer will pay, the price increase is actually now already like very insignificant. So the point here on this page, and this is a European example, but this we can also apply to other markets. But the point is already that if we look at the end customer, so what it means for them, is that we can already see that we can make the economics work. So now to close out, I think the global view, we are fairly positive about this market. The demand is real, the technology is ready, we are getting better at sorting the feedstock, so it's for us very much of a green light, and hope we can scale it together. Now, Adolf, I'm gonna hand it over for you to translate this into the African view. Sure.
No, thank you very much. And maybe just quickly by way of introduction, as earlier mentioned, Vincent is one of our deep experts on plastics and on sustainability. On my end, the other side, I'm just an ordinary ops guy. I do quite a lot of work in ops, so most of the companies in CPG or in heavy industry that you have touched on, I do quite a lot of work with them on that. So on this part of the conversation, I'm going to try to get a bit more into implications of some of the stuff that you're talking about on Africa. And maybe just as a starting point, this is a global picture. As Vincent mentioned, demand is high for recycling. Demand for plastics is high. Also, there is no major cost differential. Technology is there. This is an investable case. But only 19% of our plastics are recycled. The other 80% globally is either in a landfill, or it's incinerated, or it ends up in some random dumps. This is global. And when we come to Africa, the picture is even worse. We are sitting at about 5% of the plastic that is recycled. Of course, it differs depending on which country. But if I use South Africa as an example, I think last year we consumed about 2 million tons of polymers that went into manufacturing of plastics, 2 million tons. Of that 2 million tons, probably about 350,000 was recycled. The rest was virgin. So why is it like this? What's going on in this? And of course, taking my lens in ops, when I go through supply chains and everything, why is it so that we are failing to get this industry moving? So just a few things that we're going to touch on. And I know that I'm going to cover quite a lot of things and hopefully try to cover them in the next 10 minutes, which feels like speed dating a bit. Not that I know what speed dating is, but it feels like it. So firstly, we start with what happens upstream, which is the generation of waste, the collection, everything that happens in sorting and aggregation, treatment until it gets to commercialization. And here the key messages, I know that there are too many words on the page, but the key messages that I just want to land is that number one, the quality of the feedstock. We do have quite a lot of waste that is collected, but most of that waste that is collected is contaminated and cannot be used. And for those in South Africa, you know very well that we do have collectors of waste, and that actually alone has created probably, I think some estimates talk about 50,000 informal jobs of people who do collection of waste in your bins. But collection is a big issue. And even after you have done that, in terms of the quality of the feedstock. The second part, which probably ties to the first part, which is the collection of feedstock, is once we have feedstock that is contaminated, what it takes to do separation, because separation is not happening at source. I think quite a lot of people here in South Africa, and I know many households, that even this separation at source is not something that happens, it's not something that is common, and even in the rest of Africa. So yes, the cost of what it takes now to sort this waste before it gets to the point of being produced. So yes, you mentioned earlier on about the price differential between recycled plastic and virgin plastic. But once we start adding costs that are involved in this, especially at this point of trying to improve the quality of the feedstock, that's where the prices start piling up. The technology on its own to do this, as you mentioned earlier on, it's there. There is a lot that is still coming in there, but it's largely within the supply chain that's making the situation more difficult to do. So if I look at what does this look like in the rest of Africa pretty quickly, as you can see that the intensity of the challenge here is that collection rates are relatively high. But once we get to the quality issue, that's where we have the same issue, which is probably the point I was just emphasizing on earlier on, that part of that supply chain, either now it's making the feedstock much less because of the contamination, or the cost of fixing that quality is what's harming us the most. I'm not going to spend too much time hammering on the same point, because this was just trying to break down just one example of Kenya, where there is quite a lot of collected solid waste. But if you look at the amount that is disposed of, either improperly or properly because it's going into landfills, until you get to how much of it is actually going into recycling, is quite low. Now, you mentioned earlier on about what's happening on the regulatory side. I think there is quite a lot of push as well within regulation that's actually pushing, especially around this extended producer responsibility. And I think this affects quite a lot of us who are in this room because we play in this area and responsibility is going to continue pushing. But I think someone earlier on in the conversation spoke about the collaboration because the industry on itself, for us to be able to achieve circularity, requires many other players beyond just the producers of plastic. So yes, there is extended producer responsibility, but still requires collaboration with everybody else in the supply chain, especially to make sure feedstock quality and how we handle the feedstock going forward. Then, of course, the brand commitments, I think we know very well. And if I use South Africa example as well, like myself in South Africa, I think there are so many households that have got cupboards full of these black bags from one retailer who decided not to go on, and at least in my house, because I always forget carrying it when I'm going to the shopping, and I come up with a new one, and then we end up with a pile of them. But there is quite a lot of commitment that we're seeing from some of our retailers, and especially on the packaging side. But I want to also mention that of the 2 million, I said, polymers that were consumed in making of plastic, about half of that is going into packaging. The other half is going into industrial uses. So even on industrial uses themselves, whether it's agriculture, construction, how are we doing about reusability of waste that come from there? I'm going to just close off with just a summary of most of the things that we've covered here. That number one, on technology, yes, it is important, but it's not as critical because the industry itself is not as nascent as it was years before. We've got quite a lot of technology to address this. And even off-tech, we know that most of the companies around are actually increasing this demand for this. Regulation, we know, is actually pushing in that direction. On the capital side, I think there was a conversation that happened earlier on as well when there was a presentation around the need for investment into this space, and we don't take that for granted. But I just want to overemphasize again on the point on the feedstock, because most of the work there could either be on the separation of waste to get it to quality, or on the collection of the waste, or how the entire supply chain is managed. So I think just as a last point of departure on this is, as we think about this, as we think about the collaboration in terms of how do we get this entire process work together, especially moving from in Africa where we are at 5% of plastic is being recycled, to move it better, it's actually the collaboration across the entire supply chain. Thank you very much.